We've had so many questions. Specifically, it looks like Cassandra, how do movement chaplains keep themselves well, avoid emotional, spiritual, and physical burnout? That is a big question that comes up a lot. Actually, Victor, if you wouldn't mind sharing, I know there was a conversation we had together as panelists before the conversation, just about things you wanted to share. If you wouldn't mind sharing about self-care and your journey there.
Yeah, and because self-care is one of those terms that's been used in many different ways, and I think it's also been privatized for benefits and profits, and it's been capitalized, I guess. About 5 years ago, I think before, because I'm going my own transformation, I think this process of a movement chaplaincy has helped me in that process of realizing that we have to shift from what is known as the martyr syndrome in progressive justice work, because I was living that syndrome. I was the walking example of the martyr syndrome. Up until 5 years ago, I was like 80 hours a week. If I burn out, I just take my 2-week vacation and come back all energized and ready to burn out again. The self-sacrifice piece, it really destroyed the meaningful parts of my life. And I thought that was okay because I was made to be a martyr for the movement. And I just think we need to shift that. I really I burned out 5 years ago. I was hospitalized. My partner, Lorene, my wife, my beautiful wife, had helped me through this process. And that's when I started realizing, you know what, I have a choice. I think the universe, the mystery, gave me another chance to, reframe my life as a justice activist and tap into the importance of self-compassion. And I really honestly believe like we're so great at giving compassion to all those around us who are in need, but that has to be balanced out with the compassion to yourself. And that is not selfishness at all. That is being a whole, true activist. And I know there's a lot of pushback when I talk about this because there's still the martyr syndrome is entrenched, but I think part of this process is we need to dismantle that. We need to create a sustainable, compassionate movement where we compassionate to others, compassionate to ourselves, and then it helps then how we relate to each other and how we deal with conflicts and at the times of tough dialogues between ourselves. But I think you're not fully gonna be there for what's needed of you as a movement activist if you don't bring in your self-compassion.
So I agree with you, Victor. And part of the way that I have started to deconstruct that that idea of the martyr activist is putting it in light of Christian hegemony and the idea of the hero, like this martyr as a hero and redemptive sacrifice. And that's a place, where I part from Dr. King and talking about in the beloved community and his theories, because I think the idea of redemptive sacrifice has really done particularly women and femmes wrong and Black folks really wrong. So if you combine those, it becomes compounded with women of color and Black women in particular being mules of the world, that we are often in the place to give and sacrifice so that other folks can get over. And I've been asking a lot of particularly Black cisgender men who are clergy, when are y'all gonna ride for us? Because some of the hardest teeth to pull around this chaplaincy has been cisgender heterosexual Black men to show up with protest chaplains, because they don't look at a Black trans woman with a megaphone as a leader, right? So many of them are struggling with, how do I do this without people thinking that I've changed my politics around queer and trans politics, about how they've always had queer and trans politics in churches and in mosques. And so my conversation is, maybe you should allow those things to evolve. But as far as redemptive sacrifice, I think that when we think about it as a part of Christian hegemony, of that story of this is how we do good things in the world, we can perhaps substitute it for some other ways of being activists and organizers. I also think that part of what presses us into this is a larger conversation of our performances of progressive piety. Like, are we putting the right pictures on our profiles? Are we putting up, the right things so everybody knows that I'm down for the movement? And so one of the questions that I ask folks, particularly white folks, is if you didn't have Facebook, if you didn't have Instagram, if you didn't have Twitter, would your child say you ready to ride for Black lives? Like if you were not constantly have these modalities of confession, these public modalities for confessionality, would the people who are around you, the people who know you intimately, look at your bookshelf, look at your life, look at your bank account and say that you are down to ride for Black lives? And so that gets me to like the last point of where I organize from within my Muslim context is, and I give the credit to this model from Imam Kelly Wentworth, who serves here in Atlanta with me at Atlanta Unity Mosque. We often talk about the Shahada, which is the confession of faith in Islam. There's no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. And so we kind of chop that off as we go backwards. If you take off the Muhammad is his prophet part, you don't need that. There's no God but God. Cool. Like you don't need to have someone to emulate. Like we can go there with you. We're in there with you. So if you get to the place of there's no God but God, some people, you're like, I've had a number of conversations with folks in my community who are like, we've been calling out to God for 400 years and this is where we are. I am done with the law. Shut it down, right? So what we have left is basically an atheistic statement. There is no God, right? That is the beginning of the confession of faith in Islam. And there is no God. There's nobody keeping calendar, nobody keeping count of your works and actions for judgment. There's nobody to emulate in the prophet. If there is no God, why are you doing what you're doing in the world? Right. And so at that point, it just becomes about ethical piety. It just becomes about doing good for everybody on this horizontal plane. Right. So if there's nobody keeping count and nobody to emulate, can we at least agree that we're going to do the best we can among each other? Right. And so that means when I need to tag in, you can tag out and vice versa. And we can help each other, not because I'm getting brownie points from Allah, not because I'm getting brownie points from other Muslims, but because it's the right thing to do. Right. It's the right thing to do and it benefits all of us. And I think that is a point, and I have to kind of confess that like I am living I'm autistic. I live on the spectrum, and sometimes people miss me with this like feeling language, and that's just kind of how mine expresses it. And I'm not in a place where I feel like we have to feel the same to do this work together. Like I want us to be informed, but I don't have to feel the same thing you feel about Black lives in order to do the work to save and uplift and produce thriving Black lives in the world. Because I feel like if we waited for white folks to feel good about education, to feel good about desegregating education, we would have never gotten there, right? If we wait for Christians to feel good about Muslims being equal, we're not going to get there, right? And so at some point, feelings are important. How I care for my own internality and how we connect to each other, our feelings are important, but it doesn't dictate the work that we have to do together. Like, I think that at some point we have to be able to bring together not only our passion and emotionality, but our strategy and our reason to say, what are we trying to accomplish? We can walk this far in the road together. Now let's get it done.
And you know what you're saying brings me back to how much of this work as a movement chaplain is personal work. It's inner work. You have got to be doing your own work, examining yourself. And that it is all work you can do without ever putting it on your Instagram. It's like Reverend Kim was saying at the beginning, taking those texts and calls from people after a man was executed and helping people process that. Nobody's going to see that. You're not going to take a picture of yourself doing that and post it on Instagram. So yes, you can show up to protests and be, a visible clergy person, or be there with a religious or faith-centered message, or just be there, being a faithful person. This and we also have to think about how we show up. Like Mama Trina, you talked about that. There are certain folks who are used to showing up and being in charge, and they don't know. They haven't yet figured out how to come along in a different way. This is calling for a different way to come and be a part of movements. It's not being centered. It's, meeting those spiritual, emotional needs of folks. And that can be done without showing up. Many of us can't show up right now because of COVID. It is not a possibility that is not a risk level that we can take. I can't take that risk level right now. And I've still been doing movement chaplaincy, coordinating events with other movement chaplains in my local area, training up other movement chaplains around we've now trained over 300 people around the world. and doing things like being available for a phone line after a prayer vigil, right? So there are just so many things that you can do that don't require you being out in the street. And because this is about before, during, and after protests, movement cycles take a long time for change to happen. And so how are we going to keep people in movements for the long term? How are people going to process what they're hearing and seeing and learning, and how their minds are rapidly changing? How are we going to process the death, the violence, the things that we're seeing out in the street? And people have to talk about that. They have to have spaces and people they can talk to. And movement chaplains become a part of that ecosystem of the movement that includes healers, that includes listeners, that includes caretakers.